A poor boy tried to stop a millionaire from driving, shouting that the brakes had been sabotaged. Everyone laughed at him, but when the mechanic finally spoke up, the millionaire couldn't hold back his tears. Jamal's eyes opened to the dim light of early morning. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the small apartment was already busy. His mom, Alicia, was moving quickly, filling plastic bottles with water. Her face was tired, and her eyes had the worn look of someone carrying too much weight for too long. "Jamal, come on, get up, baby. We gotta finish these bottles," she said, her voice gentle but urging him to move faster. Jamal nodded, rubbing his eyes and pulling himself out of the mattress he shared with a stack of blankets. He yawned, grabbed a handful of empty bottles, and went to help. They worked side by side, pouring water from the big plastic jug into the smaller bottles. There were 12 bottles in total, and they needed everyone filled. "Think today will be a good day, Mama?" Jamal asked as he screwed the caps tight. "Maybe, honey. Let's hope those rich folks are thirsty," she said, forcing a smile. She was trying to stay positive, but Jamal knew they needed more than just hope. They needed luck, and fast. After the bottles were all set, Jamal put them into his little cooler, a foam box with a rope strap that hung over his shoulder. He grabbed a worn t-shirt and a pair of old sneakers. The soles had holes, but they were good enough. Alicia handed him a sandwich wrapped in foil. "For later. Don't forget to eat," she said, patting his cheek. Jamal smiled. "I won't, Mama." He headed out the door, stepping onto the cracked pavement of South Los Angeles. The sky was still mostly dark, a deep blue before the sun, but Jamal started walking. He had to get to Beverly Hills before the traffic picked up and people got busy. It was a long walk, 2 hours, but it was the only way. He couldn't afford bus fare, and he liked getting there early. Rich people were nicer in the mornings, before the day made them busy and irritated. The houses changed as he got closer. First, they grew taller, then more modern, until they turned into the big, white mansions. Jamal stopped for a minute when he saw the first one, a massive white structure with balconies, hedges, and big windows. He'd been here before, and every time it felt unreal, like he'd stepped into a different world. He adjusted the cooler strap on his shoulder and walked down the sidewalk. He found his usual corner near a massive iron gate. Across the street was the Thompson mansion. Mrs. Thompson didn't like seeing him. She'd called security on him a few times, always telling him to get lost or find somewhere else to be. But her gate corner had shade, and Jamal needed shade. He took a deep breath and tried to focus on his task. He stood by his cooler, calling out softly, "Ice-cold water, $1. Ice-cold water, $1. Not many people were out this early. He saw a gardener trimming hedges across the road. A delivery truck rumbled past him, turning at the end of the street. A man in jogging clothes ran by, not even glancing his way. Jamal's stomach tightened, and he remembered the notice they got yesterday. An eviction notice. The landlord had given them 30 days. 30 days to pay or leave. He couldn't let his mama lose their place. She worked so hard for them to keep it, working at the diner every night until her feet ached. And here he was, barely able to sell water. He looked around, his eyes catching on Mrs. Thompson. She was at her driveway, crouched near her husband's car. It was a big, sleek sedan, shiny and spotless like the other cars parked in front of these houses. She looked strange. Jamal squinted, watching her for a moment. Her hand moved underneath the car, close to one of the wheels. He frowned, feeling a strange prickling at the back of his neck. Mrs. Thompson wasn't just cleaning or checking something. Her eyes darted around nervously. She looked guilty. Jamal took a step forward, trying to get a better look. She glanced up, and for a split second, their eyes met. Jamal froze. Mrs. Thompson's face twisted, and she stood up quickly, brushing her clothes as if nothing had happened. She turned and walked briskly towards the house, her heels clicking on the pavement. Jamal swallowed hard. His heart thumped loudly. He knew what he saw, but he also knew no one would believe him. A kid like him, against a rich lady like Mrs. Thompson. They'd laugh in his face, or worse. But the feeling wouldn't leave him. Something was wrong with that car. Jamal shook his head, looking down at the sidewalk. He tried to focus on the bottles of water, calling out again, "Ice-cold water, $1. His voice came out weak. He was distracted now. More cars were starting to pass, and Mr. Thompson stepped out of the front door. He was on his phone, smiling, dressed in a sharp suit. He walked towards the car, the same one Mrs. Thompson had just messed with. Jamal's heart started to pound again. "Don't do it, Mr. Thompson," he muttered to himself. He couldn't just stand there. He had to say something. He couldn't let this happen. His legs started moving before he could stop them. He sprinted across the street, his feet slapping the pavement, the cooler bouncing against his side. "Mr. Thompson, wait! Don't get in!" Jamal shouted, his voice cracking. Mr. Thompson turned, his face twisting into confusion and irritation. Jamal ran faster, but he saw the security guards already moving towards him. "Hey, get back! What are you doing?" one of the guards yelled. Jamal stopped right in front of Mr. Thompson, panting, his eyes wide. "Don't drive it, sir. Your wife, she cut the brakes." Mr. Thompson's eyes narrowed and his mouth opened, but no words came out. Jamal could see the disbelief, the annoyance. He heard the guard's footsteps behind him, felt the tight grip on his shoulder as they grabbed him and pulled him back. "Hey, kid, what's your problem?" the guard barked, shaking him a little. Jamal struggled, looking up at Mr. Thompson. "Please, just check it. I saw her. She was messing with the brakes." Jamal's voice was desperate now, but he knew how it sounded. Ridiculous, like a poor kid making up stories. Mr. Thompson frowned, glancing at the car, then at the house. Mrs. Thompson was standing on the porch, her face pale. "He's lying," she called out, her voice sharp. "He's just trying to cause trouble. Get rid of him." Jamal felt panic rise in his throat as the guards started dragging him away. He had to make them understand. He had to do something. "Please, you have to believe me. I'm not lying," Jamal shouted, his voice hoarse, his eyes burning with tears. He thought about his mom, about losing their apartment. He thought about Mr. Thompson getting in that car. He couldn't give up now. Mr. Thompson hesitated. He looked back at Jamal, then at his wife, then finally at the car. His face was hard to read, but after a moment he raised his hand. "Hold on," Mr. Thompson said. The guard paused and Jamal stopped struggling. Mr. Thompson looked at Jamal, his eyes narrowing, studying him. Then he sighed and took out his phone. "Call the mechanic," he said, his voice low. Jamal felt a small glimmer of hope, but the fear was still there, pounding in his chest. He knew this wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The mechanic had been called, but the tension hadn't dropped at all. Jamal stood there, the security guard's hand still gripping his arm tightly. He wasn't free, not yet. Mr. Thompson paced near the car, still looking between his wife, Jamal, and the car like he was trying to solve some impossible puzzle. Mrs. Thompson was furious. She came down from the porch, her heels clicking on the driveway with an intensity that matched her voice. "This is ridiculous, Arthur, can't you see? This kid's just looking for trouble. He wants money. He's lying." Jamal shook his head quickly. "I swear I'm not lying." His voice trembled. He looked up at the security guard holding him. The man just frowned, his grip unrelenting. "Quiet," the guard muttered, tightening his fingers on Jamal's shoulder. Mr. Thompson, Arthur, turned to his wife, his eyebrows furrowing. "Christine, just hold on a second," he said, putting his hand out to stop her. Christine threw her hands up, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Are you seriously listening to this?" she snapped, glaring at Jamal with an expression that made his stomach twist. Jamal could feel her hatred, the kind of contempt that made him feel small, like nothing he said mattered. But Mr. Thompson didn't answer her. Instead, he turned his attention back to Jamal, stepping closer. "Kid, you better not be messing with me," Arthur said, his voice low and sharp. "You're telling me you saw my wife messing with my car?" Jamal swallowed, his throat dry, and nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. I swear. She was crouched by the back wheel. She was doing something under there. I didn't think... I knew it was bad." "She looked nervous," he stammered, trying to make his words sound clear, trying to make sense through the pounding in his head. Arthur looked at his wife again. She stood there, her eyes narrowing, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Arthur, this is absurd. You're actually going to entertain this nonsense?" she hissed. Jamal's heart raced, his eyes darting from Mr. Thompson to Mrs. Thompson, then to the security guard, who still hadn't let go of him. A few neighbors had started gathering, watching from their yards. Some whispered among themselves, pointing. The murmurs made Jamal's skin prickle. He could feel their stares, the judgment in their eyes. He had to make them understand. He had to make Mr. Thompson listen. "Please, just check it," Jamal begged, his voice breaking. "If I'm lying, then do whatever you need to do. But if I'm telling the truth..." Arthur held up his hand, and Jamal stopped talking. Arthur's face was hard, like he was trying to piece something together. After a long silence, he finally nodded. "Fine," Arthur said. He looked at the security guard, gesturing towards Jamal. "Let him go." The guard hesitated, but then released Jamal's arm. Jamal rubbed at the sore spot where the guard's fingers had dug into his skin. He took a step back, his eyes never leaving Mr. Thompson. He hoped. He prayed silently. Please let them see the truth. The mechanic arrived shortly after, a middle-aged man in a worn blue uniform. He got out of his truck, his eyes squinting in confusion at the crowd gathering in front of the mansion. "What's the issue here?" the mechanic asked, glancing from Arthur to Christine and then to Jamal, who stood to the side, still tense and alert. Arthur gestured to the car. "The brakes. I need you to check them. Thoroughly." The mechanic nodded slowly, a bit confused but not questioning it. He walked over to the car, his tool bag in hand. He knelt by the wheel, starting his inspection. The silence was thick. No one spoke, not even Christine, whose face had grown more rigid, her eyes dark. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the mechanic work. Every second felt like an hour. He could hear his own breath, the distant murmur of the neighbors watching from their front porches. He could feel the sweat on his palms, the tightness in his throat. Everything depended on this. If the brakes were fine, they'd call him a liar. They'd arrest him. He'd be nothing but another troublemaking kid trying to scam rich people. His mom would never forgive him. "Kid," the guard muttered beside him, his voice low so that only Jamal could hear. "If you're wrong about this, you're in a lot of trouble. You understand that, right?" Jamal swallowed hard, nodding, but he kept his eyes on the mechanic. He couldn't let doubt creep in. He knew what he saw. He had to trust that. The mechanic worked quietly, moving from one wheel to another, checking, testing. Finally, he stood up. He dusted off his hands, his expression serious as he turned to Mr. Thompson. "You were right to call me, sir," the mechanic said, his voice calm but firm. "The brakes have been tampered with. It's clear someone cut the line." Jamal let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. Relief washed over him, but it was mixed with a fresh wave of fear. He turned his head, looking at Christine. Her face went pale, her mouth opening slightly as if she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. The crowd started whispering louder. Arthur's face hardened, his eyes locking onto his wife. "Christine," he said, his voice colder than before. "What did you do?" Christine shook her head, but there was no conviction in her denial. Her hands trembled slightly, and she took a step back. "Arthur, it's not what it looks like," she stammered. Arthur stared at her, his jaw clenching. Jamal watched, his breath still shaky. The security guard beside him stepped back, his grip on Jamal completely gone now. Instead, the guard's eyes were fixed on Christine, just like everyone else's. "You put my life at risk?" Arthur's voice was rising now, anger beginning to seep through the disbelief. "You cut the brakes on my car?" "It's not—" Christine looked around, her eyes wide. "It's not what you think," she tried, her voice faltering. Arthur raised a hand, stopping her. His face twisted in anger and disgust. He turned to the security guards. "Call the police." Christine's eyes widened, her face flushing with sudden panic. "Arthur, please," she began, stepping towards him. But Arthur took a step back, shaking his head. "Just stop," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "I can't believe this." The police arrived minutes later, and by that time, the crowd had grown larger. Jamal stood to the side, still feeling the stares of everyone around him. He should have felt victorious. He should have felt relief. But as he watched the officers approach Christine, as he heard her protesting weakly, he didn't feel any of those things. He just felt sad. Arthur was quiet as he watched his wife being led away, his face stony. He didn't look at Jamal, didn't say anything to anyone. He just watched, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Jamal took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had done the right thing. He knew that, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt messy, painful, like he'd ripped something apart that could never be put back together. One of the police officers approached Jamal, his expression unreadable. "You the one who reported this?" he asked. Jamal nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, sir." The officer studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "We'll need you to make a statement," he said, his tone softening a bit. "You did good, kid. But we need you to come with us to the station. Just for a bit." Jamal nodded again, swallowing the lump in his throat. He glanced at Arthur one last time. The man was still staring at the car, his face pale, his eyes empty. Jamal wanted to say something, anything, but no words came. He just turned and followed the officer towards the waiting police car. The day wasn't over yet, not even close. Jamal sat in the back of the police car, his body tense, eyes focused out the window. The ride to the station was quiet. The officer driving didn't say much, except to reassure him once that this was just about giving a statement, that he wasn't under arrest. Still, Jamal's hands were shaking, his stomach tight with anxiety. He didn't know what would happen next, but he couldn't stop thinking about his mom. She was going to be worried sick. When they arrived at the station, Jamal was led through the door, the officer walking ahead of him. The station was buzzing with activity, phones ringing, officers talking in low voices. They took him to a small room, nothing like the holding cells he'd seen on TV. It was more like an office, with a desk and a couple of chairs. "Just sit tight here for a bit, kid," the officer said, nodding towards the chair. "Someone will be in to take your statement soon." Jamal nodded and sat down, his fingers tapping against his knee nervously. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He wasn't in trouble. He reminded himself of that over and over, but it was hard to believe, sitting there in a police station. Minutes later, another officer walked in. This one was older, with graying hair and a kind expression. He had a notepad in his hand, and he pulled out a chair across from Jamal, sitting down with a sigh. "Hey there, kid. I'm Officer Daniels," he said, giving Jamal a small smile. "I know you've had a rough morning, but we just need to go over what happened, all right?" Jamal nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, sir." Daniels clicked his pen, glancing at his notes before looking back at Jamal. "So, from what I understand, You saw Mrs. Thompson tampering with Mr. Thompson's car. Jamal took a breath, nodding again. Yes, sir. She was by the back wheel. She was doing something under the car. I didn't know exactly what, but she looked nervous. I knew it wasn't right. Daniels watched him for a moment, then nodded, jotting something down. And you decided to warn Mr. Thompson? Yes, sir, Jamal said. He hesitated, then added, I didn't want anything bad to happen. I know how it looks, me being there, but I swear I was just trying to sell water. And when I saw her, I couldn't just ignore it. Daniels gave him a long look, then nodded slowly. You did the right thing, kid. Not a lot of people would have had the guts to do what you did, especially considering how things were looking for you. Jamal didn't answer, his eyes dropping to his lap. He still didn't feel like a hero. The memory of Christine's face, her panic, her desperation, it haunted him. He wasn't sure if he had ruined her life or saved Mr. Thompson's. Maybe both. All right, Jamal, Daniels said, standing up. I think that's all we need for now. You're not in any trouble, but we do need to call your mom. She needs to know where you are. Jamal's stomach twisted at that. He nodded, feeling a mix of relief and fear. His mom was going to be so worried and angry. He just hoped she understood why he had to do it. Daniels left the room, leaving Jamal alone again. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the noise of the station around him. He wanted to be anywhere but here. He wished he was back at his corner calling out, "Ice-cold water, $1, just trying to make a few bucks without all this chaos." About 20 minutes later, Jamal heard hurried footsteps approaching the room. He looked up just as his mom burst through the door, her face a mix of relief and worry. "Jamal," she said, rushing over to him, her eyes wide. She knelt in front of him, cupping his face in her hands. "Are you okay, baby? What happened? They said—" She stopped, her voice trembling. "They said you got caught up in something with those rich folks." Jamal nodded, tears stinging his eyes at seeing her so upset. "I'm okay, Mama. I had to do it. I saw Mrs. Thompson messing with Mr. Thompson's car. I had to tell him." His mom closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. Then she looked at him, her eyes softening, though still filled with worry. "You could have gotten hurt, Jamal. You could have gotten into a lot of trouble, but—" She sighed, pulling him into a hug. "I know why you did it. I'm proud of you for doing the right thing." Jamal hugged her back, closing his eyes as he held on to her. He needed this, her arms around him, grounding him, reminding him that he wasn't alone. "I just wanted to help," he whispered. "I know, baby. I know," she said softly. After a few minutes, Officer Daniels returned. He gave Alicia a gentle nod. "Ma'am, we just needed Jamal here to give his statement. We're not holding him. You can take him home." Alicia nodded, her arms still wrapped around her son. "Thank you, officer," she said, her voice a bit steadier now. Daniels smiled. "He's a good kid. You raised him right." He looked at Jamal. "Just make sure to stay out of trouble, all right? And keep doing the right thing, even when it's hard." Jamal nodded, standing up as his mom took his hand. "Yes, sir. I'll try." As they walked out of the station, Jamal felt a weight lift off his chest. The sun was bright outside, and the world seemed to have moved on, as if the chaos of the morning had never happened. His mom led him to the bus stop, her grip on his hand tight, protective. "Let's get home, Jamal," she said quietly. "We need to talk about all this. But first, we need to just breathe, okay?" Jamal nodded, feeling the exhaustion settle in. "Okay, Mama," he whispered. They waited for the bus, standing side by side. Jamal watched the cars pass by, feeling the breeze on his face. He knew things weren't fixed yet. They still had the eviction notice hanging over their heads. They still had to figure out how to get by. But for now, just being with his mom was enough. He had done what he had to do, and he'd deal with whatever came next. one step at a time. When they got home, the small apartment seemed quieter than usual. Jamal set the cooler down by the door, the foam lid still closed. His mom sat down at the kitchen table, her eyes tired as she looked at him. "Sit down, Jamal," she said, her voice soft. Jamal sat across from her, his hands resting on the table. His mom looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. "We got a lot to figure out, baby. But I want you to know, you're a good boy. What you did today took courage. You could have stayed quiet, but you didn't, and I'm proud of that." Jamal nodded, his throat tightening. I didn't want anyone to get hurt," he said. His mom reached across the table, taking his hand. "I know, and that's what matters. We'll figure the rest out. Together." Jamal nodded, squeezing her hand. For now, that was enough. Jamal was back on his corner the next morning. The cooler felt heavier on his shoulder, even though it was the same number of bottles as every other day. He hadn't slept well. His mom tried to make everything feel normal when they got home, but he could still hear the worry in her voice. It wasn't like the trouble from the day before had gone away. They still had bills to pay, and now they had this whole mess with the Thompsons. He set the cooler down in the same shaded spot by the iron gate. The quiet street of Beverly Hills looked unchanged, like nothing had happened yesterday. But Jamal knew it had. He could feel it in the way people looked at him, when they even bothered to look. He called out, "Ice-cold water, $1, trying to sound like he meant it, but his voice came out flat. He wondered if anyone would bother buying from him today. People here didn't like trouble, and he definitely caused some yesterday. Jamal glanced over at the Thompson mansion. It looked calm, the big driveway empty. No sign of Mr. Thompson or Christine. The whole place seemed like it was holding its breath. He wasn't sure if it was a good idea to be back here, but he had no choice. This was the best spot to make any real money, and they needed it. He was about to call out again when he saw Mr. Thompson coming down the driveway. Arthur was dressed in a simple white shirt today, no jacket, no tie. He looked different, tired. His face was lined with something Jamal couldn't quite figure out. Maybe anger, maybe just exhaustion. Arthur spotted Jamal and hesitated, his eyes narrowing. Jamal felt his heart rate pick up, but he stayed where he was, keeping his hand on the cooler strap. He waited, watching as Arthur walked towards him, his steps slow but purposeful. When Arthur reached him, he didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, looking at Jamal, like he was trying to decide something. Jamal shifted his feet, glancing down at the sidewalk. "You're back," Arthur finally said. His voice was calm, not angry, but there was something in it that made Jamal nervous. "Yes, sir," Jamal replied, looking up. "I need to be here. My mom and we need the money." Arthur nodded slowly. He glanced at the cooler, then at Jamal's worn sneakers. He let out a breath, shaking his head slightly. "You know, you could have kept quiet yesterday, just walked away." Jamal swallowed, unsure how to respond. He could have walked away. He knew that. It would have been easier. But he didn't. I didn't want you to get hurt, sir. I knew it was dangerous." Arthur studied him for another long moment, then nodded again, his expression softening slightly. "You did the right thing. I didn't realize it at first, but you did." He looked back towards his house, his jaw tightening. "Christine's gone now. The police took her in for questioning. I don't know what's going to happen next." Jamal blinked, surprised at Arthur's bluntness. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to say. He didn't know Christine well, but he knew what it meant to lose someone, to have someone just disappear from your life. Arthur looked back at him, his eyes searching. "What do you want, kid?" he asked, his voice quieter. "Why'd you do it?" Jamal took a breath, his fingers gripping the cooler strap tighter. "I didn't want anything, sir. I just wanted to help. I know what it's like to lose someone. I didn't want you to go through that if I could stop it." Arthur's expression shifted, something like understanding crossing his face. He nodded, his eyes softening. "What's your name?" he asked. "Jamal, sir, Jamal Harris." Arthur nodded again. "All right, Jamal, I owe you. I owe you more than I can probably give. But if you need anything, you come to me. Understand?" Jamal nodded, feeling a mix of relief and something else, something he couldn't quite name. "Yes, sir. Thank you." Arthur reached into his pocket, pulling out a business card. He handed it to Jamal, who took it carefully, his fingers brushing against the heavy paper. "That's my number. You need help, you call me. All right?" Jamal nodded again, slipping the card into his pocket. He watched as Arthur turned and walked back towards his house, his shoulders sagging slightly. Jamal let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He looked down at the cooler, then back at the card in his pocket. He wasn't sure if things were better now, but they were different. He had someone who might help. Someone who was willing to listen. A couple of hours later, Jamal was still on his corner, the sun higher in the sky, sweat starting to trickle down his neck. He'd sold a few bottles, just enough to make it worth staying. He was about to call out again when he heard someone approaching. He turned, and his heart sank. It was Christine, her face flushed, her eyes wide and frantic. She wasn't dressed like the day before. She was in jeans and a simple shirt, her hair pulled back hastily. She looked different, almost like she didn't belong here. Jamal felt a chill run through him. "Kid," she said, her voice sharp. She glanced around, making sure no one was nearby. "You have to help me. You have to tell them it was all a mistake." Jamal took a step back, his stomach twisting. "Mrs. Thompson, I can't do that. I told the truth. I saw what you did." Christine's eyes narrowed, her face hardening. "You don't understand, kid. This is going to ruin me. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just wanted to scare him, all right? I didn't want to hurt anyone." Jamal shook his head, his voice trembling. "I can't help you. I told them what I saw. I can't change that now." Christine stepped closer, her voice dropping to a hiss. "Do you know what you've done? You've ruined everything. If you just say you were mistaken, if you say you didn't see clearly—" Jamal shook his head more forcefully. "I'm not lying. I won't lie. You did what you did, and now you have to deal with it." Christine stared at him for a long moment, her face flushed with anger. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, her steps quick, almost stumbling. Jamal watched her go, his heart pounding. He felt a strange mix of fear and anger. He knew he had done the right thing, but it was getting harder to hold on to that certainty. He took a deep breath, looking at the street around him. It was still quiet, the world carrying on like nothing had happened. But Jamal knew it had. He had seen what happened when people made choices they couldn't take back. And now all he could do was keep moving forward, hoping that somehow it would all make sense in the end. Jamal stood there for a long time, his cooler by his side, the card from Mr. Thompson still heavy in his pocket. The sun was high, the day growing hotter, but Jamal didn't move. He just watched, waiting for something, anything, that would make it all feel worth it. Jamal stayed at his corner, still shaken by Christine's sudden appearance. He felt a cold pit in his stomach that refused to go away. He knew it wasn't over, not for Christine, and not for him. But he had to keep working, had to sell his water bottles. He couldn't let this mess ruin what he had to do for his mom. He straightened up and looked down the street. There was a little more movement now, some joggers, a few expensive cars passing by. Jamal adjusted his stance and started calling out again. "Ice-cold water, $1. He forced his voice to sound confident, hoping to drown out the doubt that had begun creeping in. His voice barely echoed off the quiet buildings, when he noticed a figure coming towards him. This time, it wasn't Christine. It was Arthur. He was walking quickly, his face a mix of frustration and something like concern. Jamal tensed up. He was worried Arthur might have changed his mind about trusting him. Maybe Christine had gotten to him. "Jamal!" Arthur called out, his voice firm but not unkind. He stopped right in front of Jamal, looking him directly in the eyes. "Did Christine come to talk to you?" Jamal nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. She told me to say I didn't see what I saw." His throat tightened as he spoke, and he looked down at his feet, unsure how Arthur would react. Arthur let out a deep sigh, rubbing his hand across his forehead. "I thought she might try that," he said, his voice quiet. He looked at Jamal again, his eyes tired. "Listen, kid. I'm sorry she came at you like that. She's desperate. She knows she messed up." Jamal wasn't sure what to say. He just nodded again, the tension in his chest refusing to ease. Arthur must have noticed because he reached out, placing a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "You don't have to worry about her," Arthur said, his voice firm. "You did the right thing. Christine's not thinking straight. This isn't your fault." Jamal looked up, meeting Arthur's gaze. The man looked exhausted, lines etched deep in his face that hadn't been there the day before. It made Jamal feel an odd sense of sympathy for him. He wasn't just a rich guy in a fancy suit anymore. He was a person dealing with something raw and painful. "I just wanted to help," Jamal said, his voice barely a whisper. Arthur gave him a small nod. "And you did. More than you know." He paused for a moment, then reached into his pocket. "Look, I meant what I said about helping you and your mom. I want to do something more, not just talk about it." Jamal frowned, not understanding. Arthur pulled out a folded piece of paper and handed it to him. Jamal hesitated, then took it, unfolding it slowly. His eyes widened when he saw what was written there. "That's a lease," Arthur explained. "For an apartment. It's in a safer area than where you live now. I'll cover the rent for the first year. You and your mom deserve a break, Jamal." Jamal's mouth opened, but no words came out. He stared at the paper, then looked up at Arthur, his eyes wide. Are you serious?" he finally managed to say. Arthur nodded, his expression softening. "I'm serious. I know what it's like to be stuck, with no way out. I want to help you and your mom get a fresh start." Jamal felt a lump in his throat, his eyes stinging. He blinked quickly, trying to hold back the tears. He couldn't believe it. A new apartment, a better place for him and his mom. Somewhere safe. It felt like a dream. "Thank you, sir," Jamal whispered, his voice thick. I don't know what to say." Arthur gave him a small smile. "You don't have to say anything, kid. Just make sure you and your mom are safe, all right?" Jamal nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He couldn't wait to tell his mom. She wouldn't believe it. He folded the paper carefully, tucking it into his pocket as if it were the most valuable thing in the world. Arthur gave him a pat on the shoulder before turning and walking back towards his house. Jamal watched him go, his mind still reeling. He looked around, at the big houses and manicured lawns, at the people jogging by without a care in the world. Maybe things were starting to change for him and his mom. Maybe they could finally catch a break. He picked up his cooler, his feet feeling lighter now. He started down the street, heading back home. He needed to tell his mom. She needed to see this. When he got back to their building, he climbed the stairs 2 at a time, his breath coming quick with excitement. He knocked on the door, not wanting to use his key because he wanted to see his mom's face as soon as she opened the door. After a moment, Alicia opened it, her face creasing in surprise. "Jamal, you're home early," she said, stepping back to let him in. Jamal grinned, pulling the paper from his pocket. "Mama, you're not going to believe this," he said, handing it to her. Alicia frowned, taking the paper and unfolding it. She stared at it for a long moment, her eyes widening. She looked up at Jamal, her mouth open in shock. "What is this?" she whispered. "It's real, Mama," Jamal said, his voice shaking with excitement. "Mr. Thompson, he's helping us. It's a new place, a new apartment. He's paying the rent for a year." Alicia's eyes filled with tears. She put her hand to her mouth, her shoulders trembling. "Jamal, are you serious? Is this real?" Jamal nodded, his own eyes stinging again. "It's real, Mama. He said he wanted to help us. He said we deserve a break." Alicia let out a choked sob, pulling Jamal into her arms, holding him tight. Jamal hugged her back, feeling the weight of all the worry and fear and uncertainty begin to lift. For the first time in a long time, he felt hope, real hope, that things could be different. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other, the paper clutched between them like a lifeline. Jamal knew there was still a lot to figure out, still a lot of challenges ahead. But for now, they had this. They had a chance. And that was enough. Later that day, after the shock had begun to settle into a quiet, cautious excitement, Jamal and his mom started to make plans. They talked about what they needed to pack, what they'd need to leave behind. They talked about how things would be different, how they'd make sure to stay on top of things so they'd never have to face another eviction notice again. It wasn't going to be easy. Jamal knew that. But he also knew that they had a fresh start, and that meant everything. He looked at his mom as she talked about the new neighborhood, about the schools there, about the job Mr. Thompson had mentioned for her. There was light in her eyes that Jamal hadn't seen in a long time. He felt his chest swell with determination. He was going to make sure they never lost that light again. By the time the sun had set, Jamal felt exhausted, but it was a good kind of tired. He lay on his mattress, staring at the ceiling, a smile tugging at his lips. He thought about the Thompsons, about everything that had happened, and he realized that maybe, just maybe, doing the right thing really did pay off in the end. He closed his eyes, letting sleep take him. The promise of a new tomorrow, finally something he could believe in. The day of the move came faster than Jamal expected. He and his mom spent the last few days packing up what little they had. There wasn't much, but they treated every item carefully, each one carrying the weight of memories. They had used every bag and box they could find, and now they were ready. Jamal looked around their small, cramped apartment one last time. The peeling paint, the broken cupboard doors, the way the floor creaked in the hallway. It all felt oddly comforting. It wasn't much, but it had been home. Leaving it behind felt strange, but the thought of what was waiting for them was enough to push him forward. "All right, baby, you ready?" Alicia asked, her voice trembling a little as she pulled the front door open. Jamal nodded, picking up a duffel bag filled with clothes. "Yeah, Mama. Let's go." They stepped out into the bright sunshine, the stairway echoing with their footsteps as they carried their bags down to the curb. A car was waiting. Arthur had sent one to help them move. It wasn't a fancy car, but it was clean, and the driver gave them a friendly smile as they approached. "Need some help with those?" the driver asked, stepping out to help with the bags. "Yes, thank you," Alicia said, her voice filled with gratitude. She handed over one of the heavier boxes, her face flushed from the effort. Jamal climbed into the back seat after his mom, and they settled in as the car began to move. Jamal looked out the window, watching the old neighborhood disappear behind them. The buildings looked smaller, almost faded. It felt like he was leaving something behind, something heavy, something he didn't need anymore. When they arrived at the new apartment, Jamal felt his breath catch in his chest. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it was clean, with a bright red door, flowers planted by the walkway, and neighbors who smiled as they passed. It looked safe. It looked like the kind of place people wanted to come home to. Jamal helped his mom carry the bags up the short flight of stairs to their front door. Alicia fumbled with the keys for a moment, her hands shaking, before she managed to unlock the door. She pushed it open, and they stepped inside together. The apartment was small, just a kitchen, a living area, and 2 bedrooms, but it felt different from anywhere they'd ever lived. There were no cracks in the walls, no stains on the carpet. It was bright, airy, and new. Alicia set the bags down and took a deep breath, tears glistening in her eyes. "This is it, Jamal," she whispered, her voice full of wonder. "This is our new start." Jamal nodded, smiling. "Yeah, Mama, it is." They spent the rest of the day unpacking. Jamal helped his mom arrange the kitchen, setting up what little they had. He unfolded their blankets, laying them out on the floor in the living room, since they hadn't gotten beds yet. They would make do for now. It wasn't about what they had. It was about where they were. As the day turned to evening, there was a knock at the door. Jamal's mom exchanged a glance with him before walking over and opening it. To their surprise, Arthur stood there, holding a bag filled with groceries. "Thought you might need a few things to get started," Arthur said, giving them a small smile. Jamal's mom blinked, her mouth opening in surprise. "Mr. Thompson, you didn't have to do that." Arthur shrugged, stepping inside and setting the bag on the counter. "I wanted to. You've got enough to worry about right now. This is the least I can do." Jamal watched as his mom's eyes filled with tears again. She looked at Arthur, her voice cracking. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Arthur nodded, then turned to Jamal. "How's the place? You settling in all right?" Jamal nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. It's amazing. We're really grateful." Arthur smiled, looking around the small apartment. "Good. I'm glad." He paused for a moment, then glanced at Alicia. "And I wanted to talk to you about something else. The job I mentioned." Alicia's eyes widened slightly. "The job?" Arthur nodded. "Yeah. I've got a position at my office. It's not anything glamorous, but it's stable. It's office support. Helping keep things organized, answering phones, that sort of thing. I thought it might be a good fit." Alicia put a hand to her mouth, her eyes welling up again. "Mr. Thompson, I don't know what to say." Arthur waved his hand dismissively. "Say yes. It's honest work, and I think you'd be great at it. Besides, I owe Jamal here more than I could ever repay." Jamal's mom looked at him, her eyes soft, then back at Arthur. She nodded slowly, her voice trembling. Yes, I'd love to take the job." Arthur smiled. "Great. I'll have my assistant give you all the details. You can start next week." Alicia nodded, wiping at her eyes. "Thank you. You don't know what this means to us." Arthur looked at her for a moment, then at Jamal, his expression serious. "You both deserve a break, and I'm just trying to give back a little of what you've given me. Jamal saved my life. That's not something you forget." Jamal felt his cheeks flush, and he looked down, a smile tugging at his lips. It was strange hearing Arthur say that. He hadn't really thought of it that way. He just knew he had to do something that day, even if it scared him. Arthur stayed for a little while longer, chatting with Jamal and his mom, making sure they had everything they needed. When he finally left, Alicia closed the door softly behind him, turning to Jamal with a look that said 1,000 words without saying anything at all. "We're going to be okay, Jamal," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "We're finally going to be okay." Jamal nodded, feeling the tears prick his eyes. He hugged his mom, holding her tight, letting the reality of it all settle in. It wasn't just a dream. It was real. They were safe. They had a place to call their own, and his mom had a job that could keep them going. That night they lay on their blankets on the living room floor, the stars just visible through the small window. Jamal listened to his mom's breathing, steady and calm, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt his own heart start to slow down, his mind finally letting go of the constant worry. He thought about Mr. Thompson, about Christine, about everything that had happened. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew one thing. He had made the right choice. He had listened to that voice inside him, the one that told him to do something when everyone else told him to stay quiet. As he drifted off to sleep, Jamal smiled. He had made a difference, and because of that, his life, and his mom's life, was finally on a better path. The morning sun filtered in through the curtains of their new apartment, casting a warm glow across the living room. Jamal blinked awake, stretching his arms as he took in the unfamiliar but welcoming sight. The place was still largely empty, just a few boxes and their blankets on the floor, but it felt different. It felt right. His mom was already up, bustling quietly in the kitchen area. Jamal could hear her humming a tune under her breath, something she hadn't done in a long time. He smiled and sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Morning, Mama," he called, his voice still a bit sleepy. Alicia turned and smiled at him, her eyes bright with an excitement that hadn't been there before. "Morning, baby. I'm making some toast. It's not much, but we'll make do until we get a real stove." Jamal got to his feet, walking over to the kitchen where his mom was using a small portable burner Arthur had brought them. He looked at the toast she was flipping in the pan, and his stomach growled loudly. His mom chuckled. "Looks like somebody's hungry." Jamal grinned, sitting down at the small fold-out table Arthur had also provided. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. "I could eat a horse, Mama." Alicia placed a couple of pieces of toast in front of him, then sat down across from him. "We're starting over, Jamal," she said softly, her eyes filled with hope. "This is our new start." Jamal nodded, picking up a piece of toast and taking a big bite. "I know, Mama. It's going to be different this time." He chewed, looking around the small but clean kitchen. He could imagine it filled with real furniture, his mom cooking dinner, everything feeling normal. He couldn't wait. After breakfast, they spent some time unpacking. They had managed to find a few more things they needed: a lamp, a second-hand chair for the living room. Jamal helped his mom hang up a few old photos on the walls, little memories that made the space feel more like theirs. By mid-morning, there was a knock at the door. Jamal's mom wiped her hands on her jeans, exchanging a look with Jamal before heading over. When she opened the door, they were greeted by a face that neither of them expected. It was Mr. Thompson. This time he wasn't dressed in a business suit. He wore jeans and a casual shirt, looking less like a CEO and more like just another neighbor. He smiled at Alicia and nodded. "Good morning, Alicia." "Jamal," he said warmly. Alicia blinked, surprised but smiling. "Mr. Thompson, good morning. What brings you here?" she asked. Arthur stepped inside, glancing around the still bare apartment. "I just wanted to see how you're settling in," he said, holding up a small bag. "I brought you a little something." He handed the bag to Alicia, who looked at it with wide eyes. She opened it slowly, and Jamal peeked over her shoulder. Inside were a few basic kitchen supplies, a set of dish towels, a spatula, and a small pot. Alicia's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Thompson, you didn't have to do this," she said, her voice cracking. Arthur shook his head, smiling gently. "I wanted to. You're part of my family now," he said simply. "And I want to make sure you have what you need." Jamal watched as his mom wiped her eyes, her voice catching as she thanked Arthur again. He felt something warm in his chest, a sense of belonging, of having people who cared. Arthur wasn't just helping them, he was becoming part of their life in a way that felt genuine. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," Jamal said, his voice earnest. "We really appreciate everything." Arthur nodded, his expression softening. "You're welcome, Jamal, and please call me Arthur. You've earned that." Jamal grinned, nodding. "Okay, Arthur." Arthur stayed for a little while, chatting with Jamal's mom about the new job she was about to start. She was nervous, but Arthur reassured her that she would do great. "We're just a bunch of normal folks trying to get things done, Alicia. You'll fit right in," he said, giving her a reassuring smile. When Arthur left, the apartment seemed even brighter. Jamal watched his mom as she went back to unpacking, her movements lighter than they had been in a long time. He could see it in her eyes. The worry that had haunted her was fading. Slowly but surely, they were moving forward. Later in the day, Jamal decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. He wanted to get to know the area, see what was around. The streets here were different from where they used to live, cleaner, quieter, safer. He felt like he could breathe easier here. He walked down the block, taking in the sights of the small stores and cafes. There was a park not far from their building, with a few kids playing on the swings and a couple of older folks sitting on benches chatting. Jamal smiled to himself. It felt normal. It felt good. As he was walking back towards their apartment, he noticed a familiar face across the street. It was one of his old friends from his old neighborhood, Tyrell. He hadn't seen Tyrell in a while, not since he started hanging out with a different crowd. Tyrell looked over, his eyes narrowing slightly as he recognized Jamal. "Yo, Jamal!" Tyrell called, crossing the street quickly. Jamal felt a twinge of nervousness but smiled, giving him a nod. "Hey, Tyrell, what's up?" Jamal said. Tyrell looked Jamal up and down, then glanced at the building behind him. "So this is where you livin' now?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of something. Jealousy, maybe. Jamal nodded. "Yeah, we got a new place. It's nice," he said simply. Tyrell scoffed, shaking his head. "Man, you think you're better than us now? Living in the fancy part of town?" Jamal frowned, taken aback. "No, Tyrell, it's not like that. We just got a break, that's all. My mom's got a new job and we're trying to make things better." Tyrell looked at him for a long moment, then shrugged. "Whatever, man. Just don't forget where you came from." Jamal watched as Tyrell turned and walked away, his shoulders hunched. Jamal felt a pang of sadness. He hadn't meant to leave anyone behind, but he knew he couldn't go back to that life. He had to keep moving forward, for his mom, for himself. When he got back to the apartment, his mom was unpacking the last of the boxes. She looked up when he walked in, her smile lighting up the room. "Hey, baby, you see anything interesting out there?" she asked. Jamal smiled, nodding. "Yeah, Mama. There's a park down the street and some stores. It's real nice." She nodded, her eyes softening. "I'm glad, Jamal. I'm glad we're here." Jamal walked over and hugged her, holding her tight. "Me too, Mama. Me too." They spent the rest of the evening together, making plans for what they would do next. His mom would start her new job next week, and Jamal would start school soon after that. They talked about getting some furniture, making the place feel even more like home. It was the kind of conversation Jamal had always wanted, talking about the future, about possibilities, without the fear of what might go wrong. As the sun set and the apartment grew quiet, Jamal felt something inside him settle. It wasn't just the new apartment or the new neighborhood, it was the feeling that, for the first time, they had a chance. A real chance at something better, and he was ready to take it. The first few days in their new apartment felt like a blur. Jamal's mom started her new job, and each morning she left the house dressed in the nicest clothes she owned, her head held high. Jamal could tell she was nervous, but she was also excited. It was a new beginning for both of them. On the first day that Alicia went to work, Jamal found himself alone in the apartment. The place was quiet, the kind of quiet that made him realize just how different their new reality was from the noisy chaos of their old building. He looked around the small living room, wondering what to do with himself. He decided to explore more of the neighborhood. He grabbed his old backpack, put in a book and a sandwich his mom had made for him, and headed out. The streets were still new to him, the buildings and storefronts unfamiliar, but Jamal liked that. He liked the idea of discovering things on his own. He walked down to the park he had seen the other day, It was a small place, just a few benches and some swings, but it had a charm to it. The grass was green and well kept, and there were a few kids playing with a soccer ball in the open area. Jamal sat down on a bench, watching them for a while, feeling a strange sense of peace. "Hey, you're new around here, aren't you?" a voice said suddenly, breaking Jamal's thoughts. He looked up and saw a boy about his age standing in front of him. He had curly hair and a friendly smile. Jamal nodded slowly. "Yeah, I just moved in. I'm Jamal." The boy smiled wider and sat down on the bench beside him. "I'm Marcus. My family's been here for a while. Where'd you move from?" Jamal hesitated for a moment, not sure how much to share. But something about Marcus seemed genuine, so he decided to be honest. "South Los Angeles," he said simply. Marcus nodded, his expression turning serious for a moment. "That must have been tough. Glad you made it out here, though. It's a nice place. Pretty quiet." Jamal nodded, smiling a little. "Yeah, it's definitely different, but I like it. My mom got a new job, so we moved here to start over." "That's awesome, man," Marcus said, his smile returning. "You gonna go to the school down the road?" Jamal shrugged. "Yeah, I think so. I'm supposed to start in a couple of weeks." Marcus grinned, nodding. "Cool. Maybe we'll be in some of the same classes. I can show you around if you want." Jamal's smile grew, a small warmth spreading in his chest. He hadn't expected to make a friend so quickly. "Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks." They sat there talking for a while, Marcus telling Jamal all about the neighborhood, the places to avoid, the spots where people hung out after school. Jamal listened, feeling a sense of belonging start to form. It was different from his old neighborhood. There was no edge to it, no feeling of danger lurking just around the corner. Here, things felt normal. Eventually, Marcus got up, glancing over at the kids playing soccer. "Hey, want to join in?" he asked, nodding towards them. "They're always looking for more people." Jamal looked over, hesitating for a moment. He hadn't played soccer in a long time, not since he was little, back before things got tough. But Marcus's smile was inviting, and for the first time in a long time, Jamal felt like it might be okay to just have fun. "Yeah, all right," Jamal said, standing up. Marcus called out to the group, waving them over. "Hey, we got another player." The kids looked over, then ran towards them, their faces lighting up. They introduced themselves quickly, and within minutes, they were kicking the ball around, laughing and shouting. Jamal ran across the grass, his feet moving quickly, his heart pounding, not from fear but from excitement. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this free. The game lasted for nearly an hour, and by the time they were finished, Jamal was out of breath, his face flushed from running. He collapsed onto the grass, laughing as Marcus flopped down beside him. "Man, you're pretty good," Marcus said, grinning at him. "You should definitely play more." Jamal nodded, still catching his breath. "Maybe I will," he said, smiling. He hadn't realized just how much he missed this, being a kid, being carefree. After they were done, Jamal headed back home, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his face still flushed from the fun. When he got back to the apartment, he found his mom sitting at the table, looking over some papers. "Hey, Mama," he said, walking in. Alicia looked up, her face lighting up with a smile. "Hey, baby, how was your day?" Jamal grinned, dropping his backpack on the floor. "It was great, I made a friend. We played soccer in the park." Alicia's eyes softened, and she reached out, brushing her fingers against his cheek. "That's wonderful, Jamal. I'm so glad you're getting to have some fun." Jamal nodded, sitting down across from her. He noticed the papers on the table. Some were bills, others were related to her new job. He could see the worry in her eyes, even though she was trying to hide it. "You okay, Mama?" he asked quietly. She nodded, giving him a small smile. "Yeah, baby. It's just... there's a lot to get used to. The new job, the bills, it's a lot. But I'll figure it out. We're gonna be okay. Jamal reached across the table, taking her hand. We're in this together, Mama. We'll figure it out. She squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening. I know, Jamal, I know. The next few days were filled with small victories. Jamal's mom settled into her new job, coming home each day with stories about the people she worked with, the tasks she was learning. She was tired, but it was a good kind of tired. One that came from doing something meaningful, something stable. And that made all the difference. Jamal spent his time exploring the neighborhood, getting to know Marcus and his friends, playing soccer in the park whenever he could. He felt lighter, freer than he had in a long time. He knew that they still had challenges ahead, money was still tight, and they had a long way to go before they were really stable. But for the first time, he felt like they were on the right path. One evening, after a long day, Jamal and his mom sat together in the living room. They had finally managed to get a second-hand couch, and they were both lounging on it, watching an old movie on the small TV Arthur had given them. Jamal looked over at his mom, seeing the way her eyes were starting to droop with exhaustion. He reached over, taking her hand. You should go to bed, Mama. You've been working so hard. Alicia smiled at him, shaking her head. I'm okay, baby. I want to spend time with you. We haven't had this in so long. Jamal smiled, squeezing her hand. I know, Mama. But I'm not going anywhere. We've got all the time in the world now. She looked at him, her eyes glistening, and she nodded. You're right. We do. They sat there for a while longer, the movie playing softly in the background. Jamal felt a sense of peace settle over him, a feeling that things were finally okay. He looked at his mom, her head resting against the back of the couch, her eyes closed now as she drifted off to sleep. Jamal smiled to himself, pulling the blanket up over her shoulders. He sat back, watching the movie, the glow of the TV casting a soft light across the room. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was home. Jamal woke up to the smell of eggs frying in the kitchen. He blinked his eyes open, taking a moment to remember where he was. Their new apartment. The small but clean living room, the sound of birds outside the window. It all reminded him that things had changed. He smiled to himself and stretched, feeling a sense of calm he had rarely felt in their old place. He got up, rubbing his eyes, and made his way to the kitchen. His mom was standing at the stove, wearing her work clothes, her hair pulled back neatly. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. Morning, baby, she said, her voice soft and warm. I made you some breakfast. Thought you might want a good meal before you head to school. Jamal grinned, nodding as he sat down at the small fold-out table they still used. Thanks, Mama. You didn't have to do all this. Alicia smiled, shaking her head. I know, but I wanted to. It's your first day of school here. It's a big day. Jamal looked down at the plate of scrambled eggs and toast she set in front of him. He knew his mom was nervous about today. He was too. It wasn't just a new school. It was a whole new environment. A place where he didn't know many people except Marcus. But Jamal also knew that he was ready for this change. He had to be. You're gonna do great, Jamal, his mom said, sitting down across from him, her eyes filled with love and pride. You're smart, and you're kind. They're gonna see that. Jamal nodded, taking a deep breath. I hope so, Mama. I just want to make you proud. Alicia reached over, taking his hand in hers. You've already made me proud, baby. Just be yourself, and everything else will fall into place. Jamal smiled, squeezing her hand before picking up his fork and digging into the eggs. They ate together in comfortable silence, the sun streaming in through the window, making everything feel lighter. He had a good feeling about today, despite the nerves. It was time to start over, to embrace this new life fully. After breakfast, Jamal got ready, putting on a clean shirt and jeans. He grabbed his backpack and looked around the apartment one more time, taking in the sight of their new home. He loved the way it felt. Calm, safe. He could see his mom smiling at him as she wished him good luck, her voice full of hope. Jamal headed out the door, making his way down the street towards the school. It was just a few blocks away, an easy walk. The sun was shining, the air cool against his skin. He felt nervous but excited. He could see other kids walking towards the school too, some in groups, others alone, all heading to the same place. As he approached the school gates, Jamal spotted Marcus standing near the entrance, waving at him. Marcus's grin was wide, his eyes bright. "Yo, Jamal!" he called out, jogging over to meet him. Jamal smiled, his nerves easing a little. "Hey, Marcus, you ready for this?" Marcus laughed, giving him a friendly punch on the shoulder. "Man, it's just school. Nothing to worry about. Come on, I'll show you around." Jamal followed Marcus through the gate, the chatter of other students filling the air. Marcus pointed out different parts of the school, the gym, the cafeteria, the classrooms. Jamal nodded, taking it all in. It was a lot to process, but having Marcus there made it easier. He didn't feel so alone. They stopped by a group of kids standing by a bench, some of them already playing with a soccer ball. Marcus introduced Jamal, and the kids smiled, nodding at him. One of them tossed the ball to Jamal. "Think you can hang?" one of the boys asked, grinning. Jamal caught the ball, a smile spreading across his face. "I think I can manage," he said, tossing it back. They started kicking the ball around, laughing as they tried to keep it away from one another. Jamal felt the tension in his chest easing. This was what he wanted. A fresh start, a chance to be a kid again, to have friends, and just enjoy himself. The bell rang and the kids groaned, reluctantly stopping their game. Marcus patted Jamal on the back. "Come on, man. We'll catch up with them later. Gotta get to class." Jamal nodded, following Marcus inside. He found his classroom easily enough, Marcus pointing him in the right direction before heading to his own. Jamal took a deep breath before stepping inside. The room was filled with kids talking, some sitting at their desks, others standing in small groups. The teacher hadn't arrived yet, and the noise level was high. Jamal found an empty seat near the back and sat down, pulling out his notebook. He looked around, feeling the eyes of a few students on him, but no one said anything. He knew he was new here, and it would take time for people to get used to him. But he also knew that he belonged here, just like everyone else. The day went by quickly, filled with introductions, new names, and new faces. Jamal tried to remember as many as he could, but it was hard with so much happening. He paid attention in class, taking notes, trying to focus. It felt good to be back in school, to have something to work towards again. At lunch, he found Marcus in the cafeteria, waving him over to a table. Jamal sat down, grateful for the friendly face. They talked and laughed, Marcus introducing him to more people, making Jamal feel like he was part of something. It wasn't like his old school, where he always felt on the edge of things, always worried about what might happen. Here, things felt different, safer. After school, Marcus walked with Jamal back towards their neighborhood. They talked about the day, about their teachers, about the soccer game they wanted to play after dinner. Marcus was easy to talk to, and Jamal found himself opening up more, sharing things he hadn't talked about in a long time. He told Marcus about the struggles he and his mom had faced, about why they had moved here. Marcus listened without judgment, just nodding and smiling like he understood. When Jamal got back to the apartment, his mom was already home, a smile lighting up her face when she saw him. "How was it, Jamal? How was your first day?" she asked, her eyes bright with excitement. Jamal grinned, dropping his backpack by the door. "It was great, Mama. I made some friends. Marcus showed me around. It felt normal." Alicia's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, her smile widening. "That's all I ever wanted for you, baby. Just to have a normal life." Jamal walked over and hugged her, holding her tight. "We're getting there, Mama. One step at a time." They spent the evening talking about their day, sharing stories, laughing together. Jamal felt lighter, freer than he had in a long time. He knew things weren't perfect, that they still had challenges ahead. But for the first time, he felt like they were moving in the right direction, like they were finally where they were meant to be. Later that night, Jamal sat in his room, his own room, and looked out the window. The stars were bright in the sky, and the city lights shimmered in the distance. He thought about everything that had happened, about Mr. Thompson, about Christine, about the decision he made that changed everything. He knew it hadn't been easy, and it wouldn't always be easy moving forward. But he also knew that he had done the right thing. He had listened to his heart, and because of that, he and his mom were in a better place, a place where they could start over, where they could build a new life. Jamal lay back on his bed, closing his eyes, a smile tugging at his lips. He had a new school, new friends, a safe place to call home. His mom was happy, and he was too. For the first time in a long time, he felt like the future was bright, like anything was possible. He took a deep breath, letting it out slowly, and whispered to himself, "We're gonna be okay." And he knew, deep down, that they would be.